Okay, let's go on to our next sample, which is the flat collar. So this is the type of collar that we usually see on like polo shirts or men's dress shirts. This one, my printer accidentally printed in grayscale. So you should have a red piece. This one that says top collar with no seam allowances on the edge is supposed to be an all red, and that one's for your fusible interfacing. And then you've got the regular top collar, which has the seam allowance and the notches, and we'll attach those two to each other in a minute. And then you have your under collar, and that one has a double notch at the bottom, so you know the difference between the under and the top. Okay, so I've got those cut out here. Sorry, just separating them all. There we go. One of the most important things is orienting yourself whenever you are working with this pattern. Most people think that the pattern, once they get it cut out, that it should look like this, where the point is going down, because that's how we're used to seeing a collar on a person's neck, where the point, is pointing down. But these collars have to be folded in half. So what they do is they get attached. I have my one from this morning. Let me grab it. Wherever it went. Here it is. So I'll show you this at the very end, but they get attached facing up. So the point is facing up. That bottom edge where the notches are gets attached to the neck. It wraps around the neck, and then the corners will come together right here at the center front. But then this looks like a popped collar, where somebody just popped up the collar on their shirt. In reality, it gets folded down, and now the points of the collar are facing down. So make sure that as you're doing it, you're not looking at this upside down, okay? So the points start out pointing up, and then by the time they get on the shirt and they get folded down, they point down, okay? So let's start. So this is the top. The side with no notches is the top, and we're going to attach that top edge in a second. Let's get our fusible interfacing on first. So fusible interfacing goes on the top collar, which is the one with a single notch. Wrong side of the fabric. And then make sure you're putting your interfacing that bumpy side down so that the glue is touching the fabric. Okay, and make sure that it's fully adhered before you move on. Okay, one other thing, as we go to attach these and pin these together, is that the under collar, which is the one without interfacing on it right now, has that double notch at the bottom. The under collar is very slightly smaller than the top collar. And the reason for that, so let me put one on top of the other, and I'll show you that discrepancy. So right here at the corner, you'll see one is shorter than the other by about 1/8 of an inch. The reason for that is so that the under collar helps pull all of the seams towards the back of the collar so that the seams are not visible from the outside. Okay, so that is not a mistake. That's done on purpose. And now when we go to pin these together, we're about to stitch these top 3 edges. So the short edge, the long edge with no notches, and then the other short edge on the other side. We are going to stitch together. The side with notches is not going to get stitched together until we put this on a shirt. Okay, so make sure you leave that side open. Okay, so starting on the short side to pin together, you want to force those corners to match on both sides. So this pointed corner and then also the corner where it meets the neckline. We're going to force those two to match. And then in the middle, you'll see one is a little bit longer than the other. What we're going to do is that shorter one, we're just going to pull it and stretch it a little bit so that it matches the length of the longer one. And then pin it together. We'll do the same thing on the other short side. Match those corners. And then you can stretch that middle to get that shorter one to meet the longer. Okay, and then you'll have the same thing happen along this top edge where one of them, the top collar, is slightly longer than the other. You can see when I pull those straight, one is a little bit longer, has extra fabric. So what we want to do is pull that so that they meet. You can see how that gap closes when I pull on it slightly. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin right in the center. And then just make sure that I'm easing in that extra length throughout the whole collar. Again, it's only 1/8 of an inch difference, so it's very small. Shouldn't be difficult to ease in without getting a tuck in there. Okay. Okay, now we're going to go stitch this. I'll start on one short side, go up across the top, and then down the other side. So as I'm stitching, I put the one with more, the longer one, which is the one with interfacing, on the bottom. And you can use one of two methods. You can curve it like we've done before when we're easing in. You can curve it up, or you can just pull it. Since it's such a small gap, you can just pull this top fabric to where it stretches and meets the length of that bottom fabric. So whichever you're more comfortable with. This one is going to be stitched at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All of these seam allowances will be hidden in between the layers of the collar by the time we're done. So they're all considered enclosed seams. So it's all a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to stitch out to that corner until I'm about a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. And then I'm going to reinforce this corner because when we go to trim our seam allowances later, I don't want my frayed edges to stick out the front of the collar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a back stitch right here before I move on. And now I can pivot. And I'm going to do a back stitch on this side as well. And what it's going to do is just give you a little reinforced corner so that you can avoid that fraying. We have a very small, narrow point on this corner, so we're going to have to trim our seam allowances quite a bit. So we don't want those frayed edges to come out. Again, go until you're about a 1/4 inch from the edge, and then you're going to back stitch to reinforce it, pivot, and then back stitch again. So stitch forward 2 or 3 times and then backward. Let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, trim up your threads. And then we're going to treat this very similar to a facing. So we're going to trim, clip, and understitch, sorry, our seam allowances. So the first thing we're going to do is trim. The one thing that's different from a facing is that typically on a facing, we are trimming the seam allowance that has that fusible interfacing on it, because that is the facing. But in this case, that is the top of our collar. That's going to be the outside. So we need to trim the one without interfacing on it. So make sure that you're paying attention to that. We're going to go ahead and trim just that under collar seam allowance, which is the one without interfacing. Trim it in half. Okay, and then we need to miter the points of our collar right here so that we have as little seam allowance in that corner as possible. It's a very small corner, less than a 90-degree angle, so we can't have a lot of seam allowance in there. So we're gonna miter right across that tip. And then I'm gonna take an even steeper angle and take out even more going further away from the point. So it's the least amount here, and then it kind of gradually goes back into the full seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing over here. So like I said, we're trimming quite a bit. We have very little fabric left right here for our thread to hold on to, which is why we reinforced that corner. Let's do the same on this side. So go right across the tip and then take that steeper angle and cut out even more fabric. Okay, now we're ready to turn this thing right side out. So open up that neckline and turn it right side out. We can start forming our corners, our points with our point turner. So push those out, and you want those to, you don't want them to be rounded. So this is not quite pushed out enough. So what I do is I grab it between my fingernails like this, push my fingers together and rub. And what it does is it helps push that seam allowance out and up. So you can see how they're even pointier now. Let's do the same on the other side. So this is too rounded, not pushed out enough. Okay, much better. Okay, now we need to look at the inside, and we're going to press these long seam allowances that go down the length of the collar. We want to press them over. Usually on a facing, we press them towards the side with the interfacing. But on this one, we're doing the opposite. We're pressing it towards that side without interfacing. That is the under collar. You need to make sure, super important, is that you're really pulling these layers apart as you press. That way you get that really flat seam on the other side. So make sure you truly pull these apart, press those seam allowances towards the under collar, which has no interfacing. Don't burn yourself either. Okay, and you can use the point of your iron to get all the way into that point. The same thing on this other side. Before you move on, double check on this outside that your seam is as separated as possible. If one side is kind of rolling over towards the other and you end up with this little pleat, that is not going to look good on your final collar. So make sure that those edges are really fully separated before you move on. Okay, now the next thing we're gonna do is understitch. So all along these seam allowances, we're gonna stitch those down to that under collar side. Let's head to the sewing machine and do that. Okay, so I'm going to start on one side. I'm looking at these seam allowances here in the middle. In order to get as far back into this point as possible, I'm just going to have to pull this fabric back and kind of scoot my foot back into there. Get as far back as you can. And then we're going to do an edge stitch right here on top of the seam allowances, securing them down to the under collar side. Again, this is as close to the original seam as you can get, so about a 1/16 of an inch away. And again, when we get to this other side, we want to get as far back into this point as possible. So I'm just going to pull this fabric back. You won't get all the way to the point, but you should get probably within an inch, inch and a half of the point. You can see here is my point, and let me refocus this. Here we go. So here's my point, and then this is where my back stitch stops. So you should get pretty close, but you're not going to get all the way to the point. Okay, trim up any threads that you have hanging off, and then we're ready to start pressing this. Okay, so we're going to press it from the top collar side. So this is the top collar that I'm looking at. That's the one with the interfacing on it. And I want on the edge, I want your seam to be pulled all the way out to the edge, but I don't want that under collar, which is this bottom one, to show from the front at all. So if yours is sticking out like this, where a little bit of that under collar is visible right here on the edge, that is incorrect. We want that under collar fully hidden on the back. And that should be possible because remember that under collar was smaller. So it should already be pulling itself towards the back. Along the top edge, you want that seam right on the folded edge. And again, none of the under collar should be visible. Just got scrunched up. There we go. Okay, so that is my full collar press. Like I said, from the front, I can't see any of the under collar sticking off the edges. From the back, I should be able to see my understitching and my seam right along the edge. Okay, so that is your finished sample. The photos that I want you to take for this one is a front with the top collar, a back with the under collar where I can see that understitching. And then I want a close-up of the point of your collar. And then the last one you're gonna do is wrap it around your ham so you can kind of see how this works. So with the top collar facing up, you're gonna put your ham on top, and this is gonna act like a little neck, like you're dressing a potato. Wrap this around to where those two bottom corners meet right here in the center. You can even put some little pins there if you need to hold them in place. Okay, right now we've got a popped collar, and now we need to fold it down. So on the back, fold it in half. And then as it goes towards the front, that fold is going to angle down to this corner. So you should fold it in half on the back, and on the front, the fold should point down to that neck corner, that bottom corner. Get my pin came out. Let me get it back in there. There we go. So there's my little collar on my potato. Just like that. Okay, I want you to just barely press that top edge. And this is what we'll do with our shirt, where we kind of just steam or just very easily press that top edge. We don't want it to be firmly pressed because we don't want a hard crease. We just want kind of a fold. But press that folded edge, and then you can take a picture of your collar like this on your ham, front and back.